So, this is my speech for Comms 101. My name is Jeremy Wright. My buddy over here is Bernie. And then I have my dog here, Ranger, who's going to help us. Sit. Stay. Stay. Okay, so this is for, again, for Comms 101. Ooh, cool. So, as you know, I've been a raft guide for the last 2 years, 3 years. And I really didn't know how much water I was wasting until I kind of started living in that area and, playing around a lot of these waterways that wouldn't be a thing if there wasn't people in history that were self-conscious for fresh water. So the thing that I've kind of recognized in my 2 years of guiding has been that there's a lot of waste in fresh water that we don't really recognize. And I think that there's a lot of people that don't recognize how they do it on a daily basis. So kind of there's a huge problem in the world. I think that we have a lot of fresh water is a delusion that we've created for ourselves, and that the big thing that I want people to recognize, if we get on it now, we can help ourselves in the future and maybe come up with ways to sustain fresh water a lot longer, because we've been losing it at a very fast rate. Right now I think it says that there's only 2% of fresh water on the whole world, which is pretty little comparatively, even though everyone uses water like it's nothing. So there's some things that I kind of wanted to go over. Is hopefully you are self-conscious about water. I'm always rafting with you and things like that. And if you're not really self-conscious or you don't think it's a thing, hopefully can persuade you into, using everyday little things to start trying to help the environment by saving some fresh water. And every person that it gets passed on to, I think it just kind of grows. And if you do believe the same things I do, then maybe I'll have some facts that next time you're in a bar or something and you're in a freshwater argument, you have some new facts to you. Okay, so there's a 40% more demand right now for fresh water because of our population growth on the planet. Things are starting to move a lot faster, cities are starting to get bigger, and there's a lot more waste going in places. There's a lot of things we've been doing as humans that are pretty much really bad for fresh water. And so now that there's bigger factories going in, and we have a lot of more mining techniques that use fresh water, that use those river systems and things like that that make them contaminated, and you can't really use that water anymore. And so a few things I'm going to go over is dams. How dams are kind of been a big impact in the whole nation's history, and kind of not that I'm against it or for it, but how my view is on that. Fracking, it's a not new process of mining, but it's become a new thing again. It's starting to get really popular, and there's a lot of risks to fracking, and the things in your household that you can kind of fix. So my thing on dams is there's 80,000 dams in the world, or in the United States, sorry, and only 2,000, I think it's 2,500 of them. Let me get down to that real quick. There's 2,540 of them actually produce any hydropower to the grid. So that means there's, what is that? I'm not a math major by any means, but so that's 7,800 dams that are for no use, that are just kind of sitting around blocking your water. And you have a big problem with your river pushes soot down the river, that's carbon, that kind of helps your earth grow. It's like your bloodline to your planet. If you have all these dams that just backs up the soot, and now it doesn't get to the ocean to go into the cracks and kind of get pushed under the layers to make more oil and crude stuff like that for us. So that's kind of a big issue there, is we have a lot of waterways that can't really get that natural nutrients to the ocean, and I think that's going to impact our coral reefs, and probably why our earth is kind of warming up a little bit, not Not really sure on the global warming thing, but I'm sure carbon has a problem to that. So that's kind of my thing with dams. I hope we can be more conscious about that and get rid of some of those dams that are no longer have any profitable reason to be there. So now I'm going to get into fracking. Fracking is a process where you drill a hole down about a ton of feet. I don't really know how much, but pretty far down there, because there's a layer down there that has, it's a layer full of gas and rock and all this weird stuff, but it's trapped in like a layer of rock. And so what they do is it goes into the rock and then it shoots 90 degrees, and then they push down a spiking pipe, and then while it's down there they pressurize it and the spikes create fractures in that rock layer. And then once they do that, they pull the hose up, they hook up a high pressure hose full of chemical compounds. There's 170 different compounds I think there is for fracking processes. Fresh water, there's something else that they use. It's fresh water, the compound mix, and then they use sand and rocks. And what that does is when they push that down that hose at high pressure, those sand and rocks kind of hold those fractures open while all those chemicals kind of go back into the soil, and what it does is pull out all of those, so what it does is it pulls out all the gases. That chemical compound goes into the earth and it pulls out the gases, and so now the gases are kind of leaking out, and so once that finishes its amount of supply in that section that they just mined, they pull it up, all the gases come out, they pull the gases out, and all the water that's recycled from that gets put back in the hole because it's no longer usable with that chemical compound in it now. So then they cap it off and leave that water right there where it was used, and they just kind of leave it and move it to the next spot. And the thing about fracking is you can do it almost all over the place, but I think you have a big problem with, in Idaho at least, it's a very seismic active place. We're always under seismic activity. You can go out to craters of the moon and see how we're always kind of shaking here. We're always having a constant earthquake. And so the cool thing, or the bad thing, the bad thing about fracking, I think, is if you have all these fracture sites in a really seismic area, is that these fractures can keep going and going until that crack hits a water source, and now you have a whole water source that's contaminated, or you start creating earthquakes, and you could set off geysers everywhere, because we're under geothermic heat. We're one of the most geothermic states in the United States, and so there's just like a lot of problems with that. It could potentially end up in contamination, and if you do any mixture wrong on that cement barrier that holds that water in there, if a crack happens there, it will happen even quicker. So that's just my thing on fracking. And they say the fracking will produce twice the amount of gas at the 5% or like 20% imprint on the CO2 that we're putting into there. So it's better than burning coal. It's kind of why people are doing fracking. But it should. They say it will only last for 110 years. And I think there's a lot more resources that we could take that 110 years and put into with more like renewable energy. You kind of have to figure out batteries, which are scary. Nuclear is kind of a cool option nowadays. It's gotten really safe, so that's kind of something to look into. But there's a lot more options than fracking, and I think we can stay away from fracking and kind of keep our money where we need it to be, so for our future, not just for the close future of 110 years. So there's pros and cons, and I think that the cons for long run outweigh the pros. So the next thing is in your household. There's a lot of things that people don't recognize, is like flushing your toilet is a huge thing, I think. When you go pee in a toilet, you flush it with the same amount of water you would do if you did number two. And that's kind of crazy. You could have, that's like so much water going down that doesn't need to be used, that type of thing. So a way you can stop that is you take a bottle and you fill it with water, like an old like water bottle, plastic water bottle, or a 2-liter bottle. Fill it with water and put it in the back of your toilet. Keep it away from your drain so it doesn't hold that open. And so that way the water will be displaced, and it actually only flushes about half the amount of water, which you pretty much only need. The other thing you can do is check all your leaky faucets. Leaky faucets are caused to about, there's a thing here, 60% worldwide water is lost due to leaky faucets. So, you know, those are big things to get fixed, and people don't really recognize that. You know, the people just let them go for a while if it's not damaging anything, so that's a big thing to fix. 30% of the piping around the nation is 30 to 40 years old. That's about 10 years overdue for replacement, I would say. I'm not an expert by any means, but that kind of seems sketchy that there's pockets of over 100,000 population are on, you know, kind of waiting for these pipes just to break and kind of leak into it. But I think states do a pretty good job on regulating that with the money that they get. So, on an average in the United States, 700 water mains break, which means it's like a loss for a population. You know, it'd be like Boise's water, you know, containment center just loses it, and there goes half the water, so that kind of sucks. That's one of those things that I think there's a lot of places in the United States that probably shouldn't be populated because of their placement. You know, it's hard to keep water there and do stuff like that. So, here's a cool fact. A faucet that drops once per second wastes 20,000 gallons of water annually. You know, so if you stand there and you see it, like a drop going, bloop, 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 that's 27,000 gallons a year. That's crazy. So the total estimated cost of the U.S. water system is $335 billion. Like, that's how much money they put into it to try to keep it running. So it's a lot of money. You can realize like how much the government actually does put into like keeping this stuff kind of good for the, you know, for the common good. And so I think if everyone kind of did their part too, it would really help with, you know, just kind of keeping your water safe and clean. If everyone's kind of on top of it, there's more water for longer, and we can come up with better ways of saving water. And you get yourself, you know, if you save those drops every time, if everyone fixed their faucet 1 year, you know, that's how many gallons you could estimate that we saved that year. And 33